The last hope. The derelict space station was cloaked in an eerie silence, its cold metal corridors hollow and empty. Once a bustling hub of activity, now it was little more than a forgotten shell, abandoned by those who once called it home. A young alien girl, no more than 10 cycles old, crouched in the shadows, her small form trembling with fear. Her name was Mira, a member of a fragile, peace-loving race known as the Noren. Her species, once a proud people, had fled the station in fear when it was attacked by ruthless space pirates. But Mira, left behind in the chaos, was abandoned. Her people had chosen their own safety over hers, and now she was alone, hidden in a corner of this forgotten relic in the depths of space. Mira pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sounds of her own racing heartbeat. The station's once shining lights flickered dimly overhead, casting long shadows across the walls. She had heard the stories about the humans who roamed the galaxy like savage beasts, carnivores who devoured anything smaller than themselves. The elders had warned her about them. The humans were the predators, and the Norns, gentle, kind-hearted people, were the prey. But Mira didn't care about that now. She didn't care about the legends or the rumors. She was just terrified, desperately hoping that anyone, would come to help her. The pirates who attacked the station had come for one thing, and one thing only: to take what they could from the abandoned station. They had taken everything of value, and with it, they had left Mira behind. She had been too small, too insignificant for anyone to care. The crew, the workers, even her own people, they had all fled without a second thought. Left alone in the empty corridors, she had huddled in the corner of the docking bay, a forgotten child trapped in a metal tomb, waiting for the inevitable. She had prayed to her gods, if they still listened, that someone would come to rescue her. But as the days stretched on, those prayers went unanswered. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the distance, snapping Mira out of her thoughts. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The slavers, the ones who had done the most damage, were still on the station, hunting for any survivors who might be left behind. Mira knew that once they found her, she would be just another trophy, a tiny, helpless creature to sell to the highest bidder. Or worse, she might become another victim of the pirates' ruthless cruelty. But it wasn't the slavers she was afraid of now. As she listened, her heart skipped a beat, and she slowly turned her head toward the source of the noise. Heavy, booted footsteps echoed through the corridor, unmistakable, unrelenting. The footsteps were slower than the pirates, more deliberate. She knew immediately what they were. Human. Her entire body went stiff with terror. The stories rushed back to her. Stories of humans who would eat anything smaller than themselves. Stories of carnivores so brutal they would tear apart anything in their path. Mira's heart raced in her chest as she slowly crawled backward, hiding deeper into the shadows. She had heard of humans. They were the stuff of legends, the predators who roamed the stars, eating anything that got in their way. Mira had never met one before. She had heard their names in whispers, heard the warnings from those who had been lucky enough to avoid them. They were supposed to be merciless, savage beasts with a hunger for anything that moved. And now one of them was approaching. Mira had nowhere to run. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to cry out. No one would hear her. No one would come to save her. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mira could hear the distinct sound of a heavy rifle being clicked into place. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that the human wouldn't notice her, that it would move past without a second glance. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't happen. The human was coming for her, and she knew that she was the prey. Just as the sound of the boots came to a stop, Mira heard a voice, a deep, gravelly voice that made her blood run cold. "Gotcha," the voice growled. But the words were not what she expected. There was no harshness, no gleam of satisfaction in the voice. It was tired. It was a voice worn with experience, a voice that spoke of many battles and losses. And something else, something Mira couldn't quite place, sounded almost human. The figure that appeared in the doorway wasn't the hulking beast she had imagined. The human mercenary, Michael James, stood tall and imposing, with a battle-worn face and cold, predatory eyes. His stance was relaxed, but the massive pulse rifle slung over his shoulder left no doubt that he was a warrior. Mira's fear froze her in place. She stared up at the man, unable to move. His eyes locked onto hers, scanning her small form, taking in the sight of the terrified alien child, trembling in the shadows. For a moment, neither of them moved. It felt like an eternity. But Michael didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he sighed heavily, lowering the pulse rifle to his side. "What the hell are you doing here?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. Mira blinked in confusion. The human wasn't looking at her as though she were a meal to be devoured. Instead, he looked like a man who had seen too much of the galaxy, a man who had survived wars, battles, and brutal conflicts. His gaze softened, just for a moment, and Mira felt a strange flicker of hope. This wasn't like the stories. This human wasn't like the carnivores she had been warned about. But the confusion in her chest was quickly overshadowed by the mounting fear. She was still alone, still at the mercy of an unknown, dangerous world. Would this human be different, or was it just a matter of time before the creature behind her was upon them both? Michael seemed to recognize her fear, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was trying to figure her out. Then, in one swift motion, he crouched down to her level, careful not to make any sudden moves that might frighten her further. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'm not here to hurt you." Mira's mind raced. She didn't know if she could trust him. But what choice did she have? She had no one left to protect her. No one but this stranger. And in the dark, cold corners of the station, with danger lurking in every shadow, she had no other option but to trust. Michael's voice broke through her thoughts again, this time with a promise. "I'm getting you out of here, kid. Hold on." As the footsteps of the slavers grew louder behind them, the human mercenary scooped her up with surprising gentleness, his hand firm around her small frame. He didn't give her time to ask questions or voice her fear. He simply moved, running through the dark hallways of the abandoned station, away from the threats that had stalked her for so long. The escape had begun. An unlikely alliance. Mira clung tightly to the human's chest, her small hands gripping the fabric of his worn jacket as the heavy thud of his boots reverberated through the empty corridors of the derelict station. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but from the realization that for the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone was actually here to help her. She couldn't make sense of it. Humans were supposed to be monsters, not saviors. But this one, this strange mercenary named Michael, seemed different. His grip on her was firm yet gentle, his movements precise as he navigated through the station's maze of corridors. "Keep quiet," Michael murmured, his voice calm but urgent. "We don't have much time." Mira nodded silently, though she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in his presence. This human had come for her when no one else had. She had been abandoned by her own people, left to die alone. But now she was being carried by a human who seemed determined to protect her. As they turned a corner, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Mira froze, her heart racing. The pirates. They were still on the station, still searching for survivors. The sound of their footsteps, heavy, clumsy, and filled with malice, grew louder with each passing second. Michael's grip tightened around her, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "We're almost there. Stay close." Mira didn't dare ask where there was. She had learned long ago not to question the only person who had shown her any kindness in weeks. The farther they got from the pirates, the better. But just as the thought crossed her mind, a terrifying sound echoed from down the hallway, a guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine. Mira looked up at Michael in silent terror. Her eyes widened as she saw the subtle shift in his demeanor. The human's expression darkened, his lips pressed into a tight line. "They're here," Michael muttered. and something worse is hunting us." Mira didn't need to ask what he meant. Her stomach twisted with fear as she heard it. The unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal, followed by a low, rumbling growl that made her blood run cold. The monster, the one that had been stalking her since the pirates attacked, was closer than she thought. It wasn't just any predator. The creature hunting them was a savage, relentless force of nature, one that didn't care about the girl it tore apart, or the human it consumed. It was pure instinct, driven by hunger and an insatiable need to kill. And Michael had to get them both out of there before it found them. "Don't let it catch our scent," Michael warned, his voice low and measured. "If we don't move fast, we're both dead." Mira didn't know what to do. She had heard stories of predators like this, monsters that haunted the darkest corners of space, waiting for the moment when their prey would be too weak to fight back. But Michael wasn't afraid. At least, he didn't seem to be. His every step was calculated, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to every sound, every movement. Mira realized then that this human wasn't the monster she had been warned about. He was the protector. They ran through the abandoned hallways, the low hum of the station's failing systems, the only sound other than their pounding footsteps. Mira's breath was shallow as she clung to Michael's chest, trying to steady herself, trying to believe that they would make it out alive. But the growl of the creature behind them grew louder, closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she felt the temperature drop in the corridor. The monster was near. "Michael," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. "We won't make it. It's too fast." Michael's eyes flicked down to her, his face hardening with determination. "We'll make it. Trust me." He dashed forward, moving with surprising speed, his feet hitting the ground with practiced precision. Mira, still wrapped tightly in his arms, could barely keep up with the human's pace. Her legs were too small, too weak. She was a child, and this was no place for a child. But still, she clung to him, desperate not to fall behind. She had no choice but to trust the human who was carrying her, the one who had abandoned his own safety for hers. Up ahead, Michael spotted something. A door, half open, leading into a maintenance shaft. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. Without breaking stride, he veered toward the door, slamming his fist against the control panel. The door creaked open with a low hiss, just enough for them to squeeze through. "Get in," Michael ordered, his voice commanding. "Now." Mira scrambled, her small hands grabbing at the edges of the opening. She squeezed her way through the narrow gap, her heart thundering in her chest as she landed on the cold metal floor of the maintenance shaft. Michael followed, pulling the door closed behind them, just as the creature's growl echoed down the hallway. They were safe for now. But Michael didn't relax. He didn't let down his guard. His eyes darted around the darkened shaft, searching for any sign of danger. Mira took the opportunity to catch her breath, her eyes still wide with fear as she watched Michael. He wasn't like the stories. He didn't seem like a mindless killer. But how could she know for sure? "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice shaking. "Why did you come for me?" Michael hesitated for a moment, his eyes softening as he looked down at the trembling girl. "I'm just a man trying to survive, but I've seen enough pain in my life to know when someone needs help." Mira didn't understand the full weight of his words, but she could feel the truth in them. She had seen pain too. Pain from the loss of her people, from the devastation of her home. But there was something in Michael's gaze, something that told her he wasn't like the others. He wasn't a monster. He was something else. "I won't leave you," Michael said, as if sensing her fear. "You're not alone anymore. I'll protect you, no matter what." Mira didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to believe him, but the darkness of space was vast, and the dangers that lurked in its corners were unimaginable. Still, for the first time in a long time, Mira allowed herself to believe in the possibility of safety. Perhaps, just perhaps, this human would be her salvation. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. But Michael's hand on her shoulder brought her back to reality. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "The creature's not the only threat here. The pirates are still out there, and I'm not the only one who knows how to fight." Mira nodded, her fear momentarily forgotten as a new, sharper instinct took over. She had to survive. And with Michael at her side, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. As they made their way deeper into the shaft, the sounds of the station's decay reverberated around them. But there was one thing Mira knew for sure. In this moment, the most dangerous thing was not the alien creatures stalking the station. It was the overwhelming sense that she was no longer alone in the dark. And that, for the first time in weeks, felt like a victory, a fragile bond. The maintenance shaft was narrow and claustrophobic, its metal walls worn and scarred from years of neglect. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rust and oil, and every step they took echoed in the confined space. Michael led the way, his pulse rifle now slung across his back, his steps purposeful but silent. Mira, clutching his jacket tightly, struggled to keep up with his long strides. Her small frame was no match for his speed, but she kept moving, determined to stay close. They had been in the shaft for hours, crawling through its labyrinthine twists and turns, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the pirates. The growl of the creature was still echoing in her ears, but it had faded into the background noise. Right now, the real threat was the pirates. Michael had warned her that they were not alone, that the pirates who had abandoned her were still on the station, and they would stop at nothing to claim her as their prize. Mira's mind raced as she thought about the situation. The pirates were ruthless, cruel, and without mercy. But Michael had already shown that he was willing to protect her, even at the risk of his own life. In a world filled with predators and betrayal, that was something Mira had never thought she would find. Someone willing to defend her when no one else had. But she couldn't help the nagging doubt that lingered at the back of her mind. Michael was human. The stories had always painted humans as the worst kind of creatures, savage, violent, and relentless in their pursuit of prey. How could she trust him? How could she believe that he was different from the others? As if sensing her uncertainty, Michael glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, there was no hostility in his gaze, no suspicion, no judgment, just understanding. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. "I know what your people say about us, but I'm not here to hurt you, Mira. I'm here to help." Mira's chest tightened at his words. It was hard to believe, to accept that someone who had every reason to hate her people would go so far as to protect her. She had seen the hatred in the eyes of those who abandoned her, and the stories about humans had only solidified that fear. Yet somehow Michael's presence made her question everything she had ever been told. For a fleeting moment, the walls of fear and distrust that had built up over the years cracked. It wasn't just Michael who had changed. Mira was starting to change too. She could feel the weight of her doubts, her fears, beginning to shift, to open up to something new. She had to. There was no other choice. She was here, with this human, in the cold, forgotten depths of space, and there was no going back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but sincere, "for not leaving me behind." Michael gave a small nod, his face softening. "You don't need to thank me. This is what humans do, Mira. We protect those who can't protect themselves." His words resonated deeply with her, and she found herself holding onto them like a lifeline. In this vast, unfeeling universe, where her people had left her to die, Michael's words were the first promise of safety she had heard in so long. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully trust him, but in this moment, she believed him. She had to. After several more twists and turns, Michael signaled for them to stop. He knelt beside a small vent grate in the shaft, his face grim as he peered through the bars. Mira crouched down beside him, peeking through the vent to see what was ahead. Down the hallway, a group of pirates was gathered around a control panel, arguing over something. They had their weapons drawn, and Mira's heart raced at the sight of them. The pirates weren't looking in their direction, but it wouldn't take much for one of them to hear their approach. Mira's breath caught in her throat as Michael held up a hand to signal her to remain still. "We can't go through there," Michael murmured, his voice low. "We'll have to find another way." Mira nodded, her pulse quickening as they moved back into the shadows of the maintenance shaft. She was beginning to realize just how skilled Michael was, how calculated his every move was. He was no ordinary mercenary. His movements were efficient, instinctual, honed by years of experience. Mira had seen the way he handled danger, how he calculated each step, each choice. He was good at what he did, and he was determined to get them out of here alive. But even Michael couldn't do it alone. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps and murmurs of the pirates. Mira couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had never been in this kind of situation before. She was just a child, an innocent bystander in a galaxy full of danger. Her species had been peaceful, avoiding conflict when possible. But now she had been thrust into a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. As Michael led them deeper into the shaft, Mira's mind continued to race. The pirates were one thing, but the creature that had stalked them since the beginning, it was something else entirely. Mira had never seen such a beast. It wasn't just a predator. It was something born of pure instinct, a machine of destruction that would stop at nothing to hunt its prey. Michael paused at another junction in the shaft, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway ahead. He looked back at Mira, his gaze hardening once more. "We'll be safe for a while," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to keep moving. The pirates won't stop looking for us, and that thing is still out there. We can't afford to wait too long." Mira nodded, her fear now mingling with determination. She had to keep moving, had to survive. Michael was right. Waiting wasn't an option. But even as she agreed, a flicker of doubt rose in her chest. She could feel the weight of the station pressing down on them, the sense of isolation that came with being so far from home. She was alone in a vast, uncaring galaxy, her entire race lost to her. And yet, here was this human, this mercenary, doing what no one else had ever done. He was protecting her. Mira realized, as they continued through the dark, cramped corridors, that maybe not all humans were like the one she had heard about. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to them than the stories said. Maybe Michael, and those like him, were the true embodiment of what humanity could be. Something fierce, yes, but also something capable of great compassion. As they moved through the dim corridors of the station, Michael glanced over at Mira, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said again, his tone softer now, almost reassuring. And for the first time in a long while, Mira didn't feel like the prey anymore. She felt like a survivor, standing beside someone who was willing to fight for her life. Together, they had a chance, and that chance was everything. Into the abyss. The darkened maintenance shaft stretched out before them like an endless tunnel, winding and twisting in ways that felt unnatural, as if the very architecture of the station itself conspired to trap them inside. The low hum of the failing systems echoed through the walls, mingling with the distant creaks of metal and the occasional rumble that hinted at the station's slow deterioration. Mira felt the weight of the silence around her, punctuated only by the sound of her breathing and Michael's steady footsteps ahead of her. Every so often, she would glance up at Michael, his back to her as he navigated their path. The mercenary was a study in focused intensity, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next, scanning every corner, every vent, every passage with the precision of someone who had lived 1,000 lives in the harshness of space. There was a coldness about him, but it wasn't the kind of coldness Mira had feared when the legends spoke of humans. It wasn't the cruel, mindless beast that would devour her without thought. No, this coldness was a different thing entirely, one born of survival, of battle-hardened experience, and of something more primal. He was a man of action, someone who lived in the gray area between right and wrong. where choices were made in the heat of the moment. But despite everything, despite the hard edges, there was something Mira had come to realize. He had a soft spot for her. "Stay close," Michael said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. Mira didn't speak, merely nodding. There was no point in saying anything. She trusted him now, or at least she had to. She had no other choice. This strange human, who had taken on a battle no one else dared fight, was her only lifeline in this cruel, unknown world. And as they moved through the dark corridors, she began to understand something deeper about herself. How much she was learning to trust her own instincts. For the first time since the pirates' attack, she wasn't just hiding. She was surviving. The station groaned beneath their feet, the walls shuddering with each distant tremor that seemed to vibrate from the depths of the station itself. It was as if the old ship knew it was dying, and it was taking them down with it. The last flickers of power would soon fail, and then they would be trapped here, lost in the cold embrace of space forever. But Michael wasn't concerned with the failing infrastructure. He was focused, intent on getting them to safety, no matter the cost. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Mira's neck stood on end. She stopped walking, her eyes darting around the shadows. Something was wrong. Michael stopped too, his body tensing as he listened to the subtle sounds of the station. Mira heard it now, faint at first, like the scratching of claws against metal. It was distant, but it was there. And it was unmistakable. The creature. The one that had been hunting them. Without a word, Michael motioned for her to stay silent, crouching low. He turned down a side passage, pulling Mira with him. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled against the grating floor as they advanced deeper into the heart of the station. Every turn seemed to bring them closer to the monster. And yet, Michael kept his pace steady, unwavering, as if he already knew what needed to be done. "How much farther?" Mira whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not far," Michael replied, his breath steady despite the danger closing in on them. "We're getting close to the old escape bay. It's where the old pods were stored. If we're lucky, we might find something to get us off this station." Mira's heart raced. An escape pod. The hope of escape, a sliver of light in the darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't going to make it that easily. There was something out there, something that was closing in on them. And it wasn't going to stop. The growls had grown louder, more urgent, and the sound of claws scraping against metal grew closer. It was tracking them. "We can't outrun it," Mira said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "It's too fast. We'll never make it to the escape pods." Michael turned to her, his face set with determination, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that Mira couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Doubt? She couldn't be sure, but what she did know was this: Michael wasn't going to give up on her. And that meant everything. "We don't need to outrun it," he said, his tone fierce and calm all at once. "We just need to make it to the pod, and I'll make sure we both get out of here." They rounded another corner, and Mira's heart sank when she saw the old escape bay doors looming in the distance. They were just a few steps away, just a few breaths from the one hope they had left. But that's when she heard it. The roar. A guttural, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the hallways, vibrating the walls around them. The creature had found them. Michael cursed under his breath as the first screeching claw scraped the floor just behind them. The air seemed to freeze for a moment, and Mira's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the beast's heavy breathing, its low growl vibrating through the station as it moved toward them. Its eyes glowed in the darkness like fiery coals, its hunger unmistakable. "Run," Michael shouted, his voice urgent. They sprinted forward, their feet pounding against the floor as they dashed toward the escape bay. Mira's legs were burning, her small body struggling to keep up, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't. Michael was ahead, his pulse rifle raised, scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature. The doors to the escape bay slid open with a loud hiss, and they dashed inside. Michael's eyes locked onto the nearest pod, one that looked intact, but battered. He didn't hesitate. He dashed to it, his hands flying over the controls as he yanked open the hatch. "Get in," Michael ordered, his voice sharp. Mira didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled into the pod, her breath shallow and quick as she settled into the seat. Michael followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as the roar of the creature echoed through the bay. The sound of its claws raking across metal filled the air, followed by a loud crash as the beast slammed into the pod's entrance. Michael didn't look at the creature. He didn't need to. His hands flew over the controls as the pod shuddered to life, the engines sputtering as they powered up. The ship's systems were barely functional, but it was enough. It had to be. Mira could hear the creature's growls growing louder, its claws scraping against the walls. But as the pod's engines flared to life, Michael engaged the thrusters, sending them rocketing away from the station. They were free. For now. As the pod shot into space, Mira leaned back in her seat, her body shaking from the tension of the escape. The fear didn't go away immediately, but in that moment, as they soared away from the wreckage of the station, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't abandoned. She was being protected by this human, this mercenary who had risked everything to save her. But as the cold emptiness of space enveloped them, Mira's thoughts turned to what lay ahead. They had escaped the station, but they weren't safe yet. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the creature that had stalked them was only one of the many threats that lurked in the dark. And now, Mira had a new ally, one who would fight to keep her alive. And with that ally by her side, she knew they could face whatever the universe threw at them. Together, they would survive. Together, they would fight.